happen either. Resurrections don't happen either. Why not a one-time group hallucination? Okay, that's thoughtful. It really is, and he's not the first to propose it. But let's just say a solution, something like this. Group hallucinations are not possible, but it's more likely than a resurrection appearance. Okay, if we were to use that, in the earliest sources, we have more than one group appearance to Jesus. So if we're just going to post that out there for discussion, such as the 500 witnesses, no single group hallucination will solve the issue. We have several groups, even in the earliest list in 1 Corinthians 15. So what you end up with is something like this. If you want to use a natural event like a group hallucination to explain the resurrection, you have to do something like not group hallucination, one not the only one in history. You have to have group hallucination, group hallucination, group hallucination, group hallucination. Now I want to know which is more likely. Group hallucination, one-time event, which the only one happens here, we need 4 of them, or a resurrection appearance. I'm just saying things like that upset the apple cart, upset the balance of probabilities. I mentioned one earlier. If there's a God, it could be as easy as rise. If we're going to say group hallucinations, you could say, how many of them do you need? And how many of them are likely? There's some other issues with this sort of compounding of 3 arguments of Professor Ahmed's. For example, we often hear, well, you need really good evidence, and not all evidence is good. And here's some problems with eyewitness evidence. It is still true in historiography, almost non-existent in ancient historiography, but it's still true that we need early eyewitness data whenever possible. Our law courts in this country, across the ocean, US, we're based on that. Could somebody be lying? Yes. Could eyewitness testimony be wrong? Yes. Can we produce examples why eyewitness or early testimony are wrong? Yes. If it's that bad, why do we use it? And why is it considered empirical, at least in an historical sense? It's good data generally considered, and sometimes, often, it's the best data we have. So when you get to the New Testament, for example, it would be interesting if we had early eyewitness data. But good evidence does not mean, you have to have good evidence, does not mean, I need good evidence, I need good evidence, I need good evidence, and then you say, you know what? I don't think any evidence would convince me. Just like the question he asked me about the Bible, I would ask him, how much evidence would it take you to believe a resurrection if, for example, there were to be a God? And I want to emphasize this. This is not about theism tonight. I'm just saying it changes the probability structure considerably. In fact, a philosopher by the name of Owen, who champions this sort of approach, the antecedent probability, he says at the end of his article, if one puts God into the process, it totally upsets the apple cart. He said, I accept that critique, even though he's taken this response. Here's another one. George Mavrodis, and I'm still just referring to his 3 arguments. George Mavrodis, in a critique of David Hume and his argument, and arguments like it, in the International Journal for Philosophy and Religion, Mavrodis says the problem with these sorts of arguments goes something like this. David Hume says all of evidence is against the miracle. And Mavrodis says, well, what would that look like if you have a small group and no evidence means you and your buddies at the pub or something like that? Well, you might have a case where nobody's reporting miracles. But that kind of an evidential eyewitness sort of summary is not going to be enough to say, survey says, or all the evidence says, or this is a representative sample. But, says Mavrodis, the minute you start extending your sample, the minute you start saying, well, let's try to get a representative enough number to do some statistics here, you will have some miracle reports. Now, he might say, well, yeah, but let's dig in and check those things up. And I agree with him. I agree with him. Let's get in there and check them out. But some of these things, I think, and I don't think, again, not arguing miracles, I'm going to argue another class here in a moment. I think some of these are going to make the grade. A non-miraculous event that points to something beyond this world that I think violates his own beliefs that he said at the beginning. For example, if you say, well, and I think his 3 objections go in this direction. If you say, Well, all things being considered, I'm going to choose something from the natural world. All things being considered, I'm not going to go with the resurrection appearance. Fine. How about something like near-death experiences? For example, I have here, just happen to have this. I wanted to read it on the plane, and I didn't get it done. But here are several articles of the famous Oxford philosopher A.J. Ayer, who 1 year before he dies has 2 near-death experiences. He's an atheist. He says, I think these really happened. He said, I presented veridical evidence for this. And you know, I'm more open to the afterlife. And I know a fellow who knew A.J. Ayer right before his death. He said he was really open to afterlife just before he died. Now, I've been studying near-death experiences for 30 years, and I'm going to say very, very briefly, there's some highly evidential cases, not nice lights, nice travel, highly evidential cases. Professor Ahmed said, you know, it'd be nice to believe that I'll be raised later. Well, there are some cases that are so evidential, this doesn't make them prove, doesn't force them, but they've been written up in from 10 to 20 different peer-reviewed medical journals have covered these cases. Largely public, we know the survey says kind of responses. We don't read the evidential ones. I'd be glad to discuss them. Well, why is this relevant? Because it upsets the evidential apple cart. It upsets the probabilistic apple cart of 3 philosophical arguments like these. 4, as I said, if there's a God, there could be a miracle, a resurrection like this. Not my argument about the miracle, but it could happen. Here's another one. If near-death experience is obtained, if there's evidence for afterlife, what's a resurrection? Specific case of afterlife. Wow. If we already have, in one survey in America, 8 million people who've experienced near-death phenomena, I'm only interested in the highly evidential ones. I've collected over 100 cases. I'd love to talk about some of these if any of you have a question. But here's my point. If certain afterlife cases, I'm going to say, well, are you a little bit more open to resurrection now? Does that open it up a little bit? So these sorts of considerations move the evidence. And I would say if you heard some good evidential cases, you might say, now I'm really open, a little bit more open to what happened to Jesus. Okay, just some things to put on the table to answer his questions, his first lead question, then his 3 cases, 4 total. Let me say some things about the resurrection of Jesus. And I've only got a few minutes, so I'm going to make this real fast. I'm going to talk about what the majority of scholars say. They frequently do not even address the issue of whether resurrection is a miracle, just of the data itself. Has the man Jesus died on the cross, and was he seen later, and if so, in what form? We could talk about different natural theories. Dr. Ahmed is right. We could discuss one if you want. Today, you will find almost no scholarly dissension on the fact that Jesus died due to crucifixion. John Dominic Crossan, co-founder of the Jesus Seminar, a skeptic, does not believe in the resurrection. Marcus Borg, co-founders of the Jesus Seminar, both say that Jesus' death by crucifixion is as well attested as any event in the ancient world. Okay, now was he seen afterwards? What's this based on? Many Christians will sort of punt to the Gospels. I think we can do that, but I'm not going to go there. Tonight I'm going to take a more unanimously contested case by contemporary critics, and it goes something like this. The case is that the Apostle Paul is the earliest witness we have. Michael Martin, an American atheist philosopher who wrote a case against Christianity, says the only eyewitness we have for a resurrection is Paul himself. Now, I think we have more than that, but I'm saying that's how respectfully Paul's testimony is taken. I don't know anybody who will dispute the claim, any of the following sentences. I shouldn't say anybody. The vast majority of critical scholarship, New Testament scholarship, and I'm in the 95 to 100 range here, and I've counted. We can talk more about that later if you want. Here's some statements. The earliest disciples had experiences, real experiences, that they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus. Conceded. I just published an article, 2 of them, peer-reviewed journals, not conservative journals, saying this is granted by almost everybody, published. I'm just saying it met peer review. Second, Paul had an experience that he believed to be appearances of risen Jesus. Yes. James, the brother of Jesus, widely believed to be a skeptic of his own brother, had an experience that he believed to be an appearance of the risen Jesus. 2 skeptics in this group now, Paul and James. When do we date these? And I remind you, in terms of historiography, we're looking for early eyewitnesses. The disciples may or may not, on my case so far, have written some Gospels. But those Gospels are only 40 to 60 years